am holding a Motorola base unit that has not had building power in 8 years. I wired it to a 12-volt deep cycle battery 40 minutes ago with alligator clips and 14-gauge wire from the back of my truck, and the woman on the other end of the transmission just described the color of my jacket. She said olive green. I am wearing an olive green Carhartt. She said I just stepped out the door of the relay shed. I did 30 seconds before she said it. I am standing outside the shed looking at 300 acres of private timber in Bland County, Virginia, and there is no one on this ridge but me. I have confirmed that with my own eyes, with a flashlight, and with the fact that the access road is 1.5 miles of mud, and I would have heard any vehicle. No one is here. But the woman on that radio can see me, and she has been asking me for help for 26 minutes, and the coordinates she keeps giving me do not exist in any state I can find on a map. I need to go back to the beginning of this, because 2 weeks ago I did not know this tower existed, and the reason I am standing on this ridge at 9:40 at night with a dead man's radio wired to a marine battery is a sequence of decisions that each made sense individually and together have put me somewhere I do not know how to leave. My name does not matter for this, but my trade does. I am a licensed general contractor based out of Wytheville, Virginia. I do structural work foundations, framing, demolition, the occasional bridge repair for the county. I have been doing this for 19 years. Before that, I worked for my father, who did the same work out of the same shop on Commerce Drive, and before that, I was in the Army Corps of Engineers for 4 years at Fort Leonard Wood, which is where I learned to read a structure the way most people read a sentence. Load paths, stress points, material fatigue. I see buildings the way they actually stand, not the way drawings say they should. That instinct is the reason I am qualified to tell you that the tower on Henley Ridge is the first structure I have ever looked at, and been unable to determine how it is standing, and it is the reason I was able to measure precisely and repeatedly what was happening to the relay shed wall, a thing that should not have been possible in any material I have ever worked with. The job came through Garland Burke, who owns the parcel. I was loading treated 6x6s into the truck bed on a Tuesday morning, getting ready for a deck rebuild in Max Meadows, when my phone rang. Garland runs a plumbing supply in Dublin, and I have done some work for him before a retaining wall behind his warehouse, a concrete pad for his delivery bay. He is the kind of client who explains things in order, which I appreciate. He said he had bought a 1,200-acre parcel at a Bland County tax auction in 2019. Mostly second-growth hardwood, some planted loblolly pine, and a half-mile of frontage on Route 606 between Bastion and the county line. The previous owner was Allegheny Southern Timber, a regional outfit that filed Chapter 7 in 2017. Garland bought it for hunting deer, turkey, the occasional bear. He had a tenant farmer running cattle on the lower pasture near 606, and the tenant had called him 3 times in 2 weeks about a sound coming from up on the ridge, a mechanical cycling sound. Like a siren winding up, holding for 4 or 5 seconds, winding down, then repeating every couple of minutes, spooking the cattle. Garland had gone up himself once in daylight on a 4-wheeler. He confirmed there was a steel lattice tower on the ridgetop, maybe 80 or 90 feet, with a small concrete block shed at its base. He said the sound was coming from a horn mounted partway up the structure, and he wanted me to come take a look, tell him what it would cost to silence the horn or take the whole tower down. I told him I could come out Thursday. We agreed on my day rate. I finished loading the 6x6s, drove to Max Meadows, built a deck, and did not think about Henley Ridge again for 2 days. The deck job is the last piece of normal work I remember with any clarity. I know I built it, I know the address. But the days around it have a quality now that I cannot describe in trade language. They feel load-bearing in a way that the days after do not. Thursday morning, I loaded my inspection kit into the truck. Binoculars, a 100-foot Stanley tape, My Bosch GLM50 laser measure, which is accurate to plus or minus 1/16 of an inch at 165 feet. A pry bar, channel locks, a headlamp, and a clipboard with graph paper, because I still sketch structures by hand before I shoot any measurements digitally. My father did it that way, and I never stopped. I also brought a battery-powered reciprocating saw and a come-along, in case the horn turned out to be a simple removal job and I could save Garland a second trip. My truck is a 2009 F250 with 243,000 miles on it. The power steering pump winds below 40 degrees and it pulls right above 55. The heater works, the radio does not. I have been meaning to fix the radio for 3 years, and I mention that because the silence in the cab on the drive to Bland County is part of this. I was alone with the road noise and the steering pump and my own thoughts for 40 minutes, and the silence afterward was different from the silence before, and I did not notice the change until much later. The drive from Wytheville takes Route 11 south to the 606 junction, then 606 west along the foot of the ridge. The country opens up there, hayfields and cattle land, with the ridges stepping up to the west in long parallel lines. In early March, the hardwoods are bare, and the understory is just starting to green, and the mountains look like pencil drawings, all gray lines and brown leaf litter with no color yet. I have driven through Bastion 100 times. The gas station with the crooked awning, the white clapboard church with the crumbling parking lot, the post office the size of a garden shed. I noticed all of it that morning in the way you notice things you have seen for years. That is important because of how it looked on the way back, weeks later, and how it looks now. Garland's gate is a standard tube steel ranch gate with a combination lock, set back about 20 feet from the 606 pavement. He had given me the code. Beyond the gate, the road is gravel for the first half-mile maintained. Reasonable shape, the tenant uses it for his cattle operation. The gravel smelled like wet limestone and iron in the cold morning air, the way fresh crushed stone does when it is damp. After the half-mile, the gravel ends and it becomes a dirt two-track that Allegheny Southern used for timber access. The two-track climbs steadily through mixed hardwood, red oak, white oak, some shagbark hickory, tulip poplar thicken the drainages where the moisture collects. I was in four-wheel low by the first quarter-mile of dirt, watching my line around two collapsed culvert crossings where the drainage cuts across the road. The grade kicked up to maybe 12 or 15% for a stretch, and the truck worked for it. The timber on both sides was 30 to 40-year-old second growth, consistent with Allegheny Southern's harvest rotation. I knew from general knowledge of the region that most of these private outfits ran 35-year cuts. The trees were the right age, the road was the right vintage. Everything about this parcel said working forest, harvested last in the mid-1980s, abandoned operationally in 2017. Normal. What was not normal, and I noted it at the time, though I did not give it the weight it deserved, was the condition of the road in the last quarter mile before the ridgetop. The two-track improved. Not dramatically, but the ruts were shallower. The drainage was functioning across the surface instead of cutting channels, and the crown was intact. A road that has been unmaintained for 8 years does not have a functioning crown. Water flattens it. Breeze, thaw, breaks it. Gravity wins. This road looked like it had been graded within the last year or two, just in that final quarter mile approaching the saddle. I wrote it off. Maybe a hunter with a box blade had done some work up there. Maybe Garland had graded it and forgotten to mention it. Maybe I was wrong about the timeline. I had explanations. They were reasonable. They were also wrong, but I did not know that yet. I came around a bend where the ridge flattened into a small saddle and saw the tower. The first thing I noticed was the color. Lattice steel towers are galvanized silver-gray when new, weathering to a matte zinc carbonate patina over decades. This is well-established material science. Zinc oxidizes to white and gray compounds. It does not turn dark. This tower was dark. The steel had a blue-black finish that looked almost deliberate, like a powder coating or a chemical treatment. But on closer inspection from the base there was no coating. The steel surface under the patina was standard hot-dip galvanized, with the characteristic spangle pattern visible where I scraped a small area with my thumbnail. The oxidation itself had produced the color. I have worked with galvanized steel for almost 2 decades and I have never seen this. Zinc weathers to gray. It does not weather to blue-black. I photographed it with my phone and moved on, but the color stayed in the edge of my awareness like a measurement that does not close. The structure itself was standard mid-century design. 4-legged lattice, bolted cross-bracing, probably manufactured by Air Motor or a similar outfit. I estimated 85 feet from the ground, which I later confirmed at 83 with the Bosch laser shot vertically against the platform underside. At the top was a small platform, not a full lookout cab, just a railed platform about 6 by 6, with a mounting bracket for equipment that had been removed. 2/3 of the way up, bolted to the lattice on the south face, was the horn. Even from the ground I could identify it. A Federal Signal model, too. A mechanical single-tone siren, the kind you see on fire stations and industrial plants. Omnidirectional rotary chopper design. They produce 102 decibels at 100 feet and weigh about 85 pounds. They require 120 or 240 volts AC or DC to operate. There was no power line within a mile of this ridge. No solar panel, no generator. No battery bank visible anywhere on the structure or the ground around it. The relay shed was about 20 feet south of the tower base, a concrete masonry unit structure roughly 10 by 12 feet, with a steel door on the west face and no windows. Standard 8-inch CMU, running bond pattern, mortar joints that looked tight and clean. The door was closed but not locked. The hasp was intact but the padlock was missing. The steel door was cold to the touch and slightly bowed from years of thermal cycling, which is normal for an unheated block building in this climate. I pulled it open, and the air inside smelled like old concrete and mouse urine, and something else, something mineral, like the inside of a well casing. That mineral smell is something I want to note because it changed over the weeks I came back, and the change is part of the pattern I am trying to describe. Inside was what I expected from a mid-century timber company relay installation. A steel equipment rack against the back wall, mostly empty. Conduit stubs coming through the floor, the underground feed from wherever the power and communication lines had run. A plywood workbench along one wall with mouse droppings and a water stain from a roof leak in the southeast corner. On the equipment rack, the only thing still mounted was a Motorola base radio, an old Motrac unit, probably 1970s vintage, in a steel desktop housing. Tube type, around 30 pounds. It had no power cable attached. The cable had been cut, and the cut end hung behind the rack with about 6 inches of corroded green copper visible. The antenna cable ran up through a conduit penetration in the roof and presumably to an antenna somewhere on the tower that I had not yet identified from the ground. I made notes, took photographs, and went back outside. My structural assessment of the tower base is where the first real wrongness sat, though I processed it as a curiosity at the time rather than an alarm. I walked the perimeter. Each leg was anchored to a concrete pier about 3 feet square, standard spread footing for this type of structure, designed to distribute the lateral wind load into the soil. The anchor bolts looked original. Heavy hex, 3/4 inch, with the surface rust you would expect after 5 or 6 decades of exposure. But the concrete piers were level. I carry a 4-foot spirit level in my truck and I put it on each pier. Dead flat, all 4. Not close to level-centered bubble, no question. In 50-plus years on an Appalachian ridgetop, with frost heave and root pressure and the general subsidence that affects every spread footing I have ever inspected. Those piers should have moved. A quarter inch, a half inch, something. Concrete does not stay level in mountain soil for 50 years. It cannot. The forces acting on it are constant and cumulative, and they always win. Except here they had not. I noted the levels on my sketch, added a question mark, and moved to the east face to start drawing the bracing pattern. I was 10 minutes into the sketch, counting bolt rows and measuring member spacing with the tape, when the sirens started. There was no wind-up. One moment I was counting bolts. The next, the federal signal on the south face was producing a sustained tone at what sounded like full output. 102 decibels at 100 feet means it was significantly louder at my position, maybe 80 feet below and 30 feet offset. The sound was not just loud. It had a physical quality, a pressure in the center of my chest, the way a large subwoofer hits you at close range. I dropped my clipboard. The tone held for approximately 5 seconds, dropped in pitch over about 2 seconds as the rotor decelerated, went silent for maybe 15 seconds, and then cycled again. Same duration, same decay pattern. I stepped back from the base and watched the horn through my binoculars. The rotor was turning. I could see the chopper blades spinning inside the housing. The motor, which required 120 or 240 volts, and had no source of either, was running. I counted 7 full cycles, each identical. Then it stopped, mid-wind up as if someone had pulled a breaker. The silence afterward was physical. I could feel it settle into the space the sound had occupied. The woodpecker that had been working a snag east of me had stopped. The cattle below the ridge were quiet. There was nothing except wind and bare oak branches and my own pulse in my ears. I am a structural contractor, not an electrician. But I spent 4 years in the Corps, and I understand electrical systems well enough to troubleshoot them. I went back into the relay shed and examined every conduit stub in the floor. All cut. Dead. No junction box, no transformer, no battery bank, no inverter, no solar controller. I went back outside and traced the conduit runs on the tower legs. The northeast leg carried a conduit run from the shed roof penetration up to the platform that was the antenna feed for the Motorola. The southwest leg carried a separate conduit run that branched off at the 2/3 point and terminated at the horn's mounting bracket. I traced it back down to the base. It entered the concrete pier through a small penetration and did not emerge anywhere inside the shed. It went into the ground under the footing. I walked a 50-foot radius looking for where it might surface. It did not surface. The horn had a conduit run to it, but the conduit's origin was buried under a concrete pier with no exit point I could find. I could have opened the pier, jackhammered the concrete, but that was not the scope of the job, and at that point I was still assembling explanations. An old battery buried in the pier, charged by some residual mechanism I hadn't found, cycling on a corroded timer relay. Unlikely, but I had seen stranger things in old industrial installations. What I had not seen was what I found when I climbed to the horn the following Monday. But that discovery is what changed the nature of everything, and I need to describe the days between, because those days were the last ones where I still had a framework. I called Garland from the saddle. Service was marginal 1 bar, voice only. I told him the horn was cycling intermittently and the power source was unclear. I told him the structure was in oddly good condition for its age, and a full demolition would be a real job. He asked me what I would charge for just the horn. I gave him a number. He said go ahead and get it done. I said I would come back Monday with my extension ladder and climbing harness. He said fine. I drove home. The drive down the ridge was normal. The drive through Bastion was normal. The gas station awning was crooked. The church parking lot was crumbling. Everything was as it had always been. I went home, ate dinner, and spent the evening on my laptop at the kitchen table doing something I do for most jobs, which is background research on the property. There's not much on Allegheny's southern timber. They operated in Bland, Giles, and Craig counties. Founded in 1961 by a man named Harold Lotz, who ran it until his death in 2003. His son, Gerald, took over, apparently without his father's aptitude because the company started selling parcels in 2012 and filed Chapter 7 in 2017. The relevant document I found was in the Bland County Planning Commission records, digitized and searchable through the county website. A 1979 application by Allegheny Southern for a special use permit to install an emergency communication and alert installation on the Henley Ridge parcel, tax map 47-A-12. The permit was approved with no public comment. The installation was described as a steel lattice tower with relay equipment and a federal signal audible alert device for fire and weather emergencies. Normal enough for a timber company with remote holdings. But the permit also noted that the tower would be connected to the county's existing emergency communication network via a repeater link on the 150 MHz band. I searched the county records for any reference to Henley Ridge in the emergency communication system, frequency assignments, repeater licenses, maintenance contracts, system maps. There was nothing. The tower had been permitted as part of a network it had never joined. It was built to connect to something and then never connected or connected to something that was not the county system. That gap in the record is something I want to mark, because there was a second gap in a different document that I did not find until later, and when the two gaps lined up, the nature of what I was looking at changed. I went back Monday morning. The weather had shifted to overcast, low ceiling, temperature around 42 degrees. The kind of raw March day where the mountains lose all their depth and look like flat cutouts stacked behind each other. No shadows, no highlights, just gray paper shapes. I had my 28-foot extension ladder ratchet strapped across the truck bed, my climbing harness with the positioning lanyard, and the reciprocating saw with the Lennox metal cutting blade. The plan was simple. Climb to the horn, assess the electrical connection, disconnect or cut whatever was feeding it, and if possible unbolt it and lower it on a rope. A 2-hour job on a good day. I set up the ladder on the south face of the tower, footed it against the pier, and extended it to full reach about 26 feet. The horn was at roughly 55 feet. I needed to free climb the lattice from the top of the ladder to the horn bracket, about 30 feet of climbing on the outside of the structure with my lanyard clipped to the cross braces. Not my first lattice climb. I am not a certified tower tech, but I have climbed enough steel to know my limits and my gear. I put on the harness, tightened the leg loops, clipped the lanyard to the lowest brace I could reach from the ladder top, and started up. The steel was cold through my gloves. That blue-black patina I had noted on Thursday was smooth under my fingers, almost slick, not the grippy texture of normal oxidation. Weathered steel should feel rough. This felt like something that had been worked, not corroded. I climbed past the first set of diagonal braces, reclipped, and kept moving. At 40 feet I stopped, hooked in, and took a breath. The effort of climbing with cold hands on cold steel in a stiff breeze was real. My forearms were pumped and my fingers tingled inside the gloves. I looked south over the ridge. The saddle opened into a long view the tenant's pasture, the tree line dropping into the valley, Route 606 visible as a gray thread, and beyond it the town of Bastion, small and flat in the overcast light. I could see the church steeple, I could see the gas station's crooked awning, a tiny detail at that distance but visible because I knew where to look. The view was familiar and correct. I note that because the view from this exact position on the tower changed later, and when it changed, I was the only person who had a baseline to measure the change against. I reached the horn at 55 feet. Up close, the Federal Signal Model 2 was exactly what the spec sheet says, a cast aluminum housing about 20 inches wide and 25 inches tall. with the rotary chopper assembly visible through the intake vents. 4 bolts into a welded bracket on the lattice member. The horn was mounted solidly, no play, no corrosion on the bracket welds, which was unusual for 50-year-old steel exposed to mountain weather. I found where the conduit from the southwest leg terminated at the horn housing and opened the junction box on the back of the unit with my channel locks. There were no wires inside. The conduit was empty, no conductors, no wire nuts, no evidence that wire had ever been pulled through it. The horn motor's terminal block had 2 brass studs with nuts and flat washers. Nothing was attached, no leads, no pigtails, no solder residue, no discoloration from previous connections. The terminals were factory clean. I held my headlamp 6 inches from the terminal block and examined every surface. These terminals had never had wire landed on them. The Federal Signal Model 2 is a straightforward device. You run 2 conductors from your power source to the motor terminals. You energize the circuit, and the motor spins the chopper. No conductors had ever been connected. The installation was not disconnected, it was incomplete. It had been incomplete since 1979, and it was producing a 102 decibel tone on a ridge where there was no electricity. I sat in my harness at 55 feet, clipped to a blue-black lattice tower in Bland County, looking at a terminal block that should have told me the horn could not operate. The wind picked up and the tower hummed faintly, a low resonance I could feel through the harness and into my hips. That hum was something I had not heard from the ground. I do not know if it was wind vibration in the lattice members, which is normal for a steel tower in wind, or something else. I know that it did not feel normal against my body. It felt like the tower was conducting something I could not measure, and the frequency of it sat just below what I could hear and just above what I could ignore. I did not remove the horn. There was nothing to disconnect, and unbolting 85 pounds of cast aluminum while alone on a lattice with no rigging point was not safe. I climbed down, slower than I went up, my hands stiff and my head full of a problem that had no solution in my trade vocabulary. Back on the ground, I sat in my truck with the engine running and the heater on, and ate a sandwich and drank coffee from my thermos. The coffee was lukewarm, but the caffeine helped. The saddle was quiet. No siren. No hum. Just wind and the tick of my engine cooling and the smell of my own sweat drying in the warm cab. I opened my notebook and wrote down what I knew. I wrote down what I did not know. The second list was longer. Then I wrote a third list, which was questions for the next visit. And the first question on that list was, what is the power source, and is it in the pier or in the ground under the pier? That question mattered to me as a contractor because it was answerable with a hammer drill and a concrete saw. What I could not have known, sitting in my truck eating a turkey sandwich on a Monday afternoon in March, was that the power question would become irrelevant within the week, because what happened in the relay shed 3 days later made the horn the least important thing on that ridge. Wednesday. Overcast again, but warmer low 50s. The kind of damp warmth that starts the hepatica blooming on south-facing slopes and makes the leaf litter smell like turned earth and rot. The smell of the Appalachian spring starting its annual argument with winter. I had come back to measure the piers for drilling points. I wanted to take a core sample of the concrete to see if there was any embedded conduit or hardware inside the footing that did not show on the exterior. I parked at the saddle, got out, and walked to the tower with my drill case and tape. The horn was silent. The piers were as I had left them. I was on my knees at the southwest pier, measuring for drill points, when I decided to check the relay shed again. The reason I went inside was the smell. Standing at the pier, downwind of the shed's open door, I caught that mineral smell again, the well casing smell I had noticed on Thursday, but it was stronger. It had a warmth to it now, like heated stone rather than cold stone, and it was coming from the shed in a steady draft, as if the interior were warmer than the exterior and the pressure differential was pushing air out. In a concrete block building with no heat source in March, the interior should be colder than the outside air, or at most equal. It should not be drafting warm air. I went inside. The Motorola base unit on the equipment rack was warm. Not hot. Warm to the touch, the way electronics feel when they have been powered for 20 or 30 minutes. I put my palm flat on the steel housing and held it there. Body temperature, approximately. The cut power cable still hung behind the rack, still corroded, still unconnected to anything. But the radio's front panel, the dial glass, the channel knob, the volume pot had a faint glow. Not illuminated. More like phosphorescence. The kind of residual light you see on old watch dials treated with radium paint. Dim enough that I would not have noticed it in daylight, but in the windowless shed with the door half closed behind me, I could see it. I also heard a sound. A faint, continuous hiss, like a carrier signal with no modulation, coming from the speaker grill, from a radio with no power cable. I stood in the doorway for a long time. Then I went to the truck, opened the steel toolbox bolted to the bed, and came back with a 12-volt Interstate SRM-27 deep cycle marine battery, 88 amp hours, 50 pounds. I carry it for running my portable concrete saw and other 12-volt tools. I set it on the floor next to the equipment rack, stripped the cut end of the Motorola's power cable back to bare copper with my lineman's pliers, and clamped the alligator clips on. Positive to the red conductor. Negative to chassis ground on the rack. The Motorola's front panel lit up. Dial lamp, channel indicator, transmit light. The hiss from the speaker sharpened and then resolved, the way an FM signal comes in when you hit the center of the channel. And then the voice. A woman's voice. Mid-range, steady, with a compressed quality, the low frequency stripped out. The way a voice sounds through a long pipe or a small room with hard walls. She said, "Hello. Can anyone hear me? I can see the light. I can see the light in the building. Please respond." I looked at the transmit indicator. It was dark. No one was keying this radio. The voice was being received, not generated. I reached for the transmit button on the desk mic, which was still plugged into the front panel Jack had been plugged in for 8 years, or 45 years. I did not know which. I pressed the button. I said, "This is Henley Ridge Relay. Who is calling?" She said, "Oh, thank God. My name is Dana Kelly. I've been trying to reach someone for I don't know how long. I am at," and she read off coordinates. I grabbed my clipboard and wrote them down. 38.7214 north, 83.1056 west. She read them slowly, clearly, twice. I repeated them back. She confirmed. Then she said, "Can you send help? I am in a building and the door will not open and I do not know where I am." Her voice was calm. Not forced calm, not the controlled calm of someone managing panic. Flat calm, the calm of someone who has been afraid for a long time and exhaustion has sanded the fear down to something level and continuous, like background noise. I recognized it because I have heard it once before, from a man pinned under a collapsed retaining wall on a job site in Radford, 3 hours into the wait for the rescue crew. That man had stopped being scared and started being patient, and the patience was worse to hear than the screaming. Dana Kelly sounded like that. I told her I was not emergency services. I told her I was a contractor working on the tower and I had found the radio and connected it. I told her I would call 911. She said, "I've been saying those coordinates for a long time and no one has come." I said, "I hear you. I'm going to get you help." I meant it. I walked outside to make the call on my cell phone 1 bar, barely enough, and that is when she said, "You're wearing an olive green jacket. You just walked out the door." I stopped. I turned around and looked at the shed. The door was open. My headlamp was on the workbench inside, casting a cone of light on the plywood surface. There was no one in the shed. There was no one on the ridge. The access road was 1.5 miles of mud, and I had not heard a vehicle. I said, "Where are you?" She said, "I'm in a room. There's a window. I'm looking through the window and I can see you standing outside. You're looking at the building. The building I can see through the window is the building with the radio." I looked at the shed again. Concrete block, steel door, no windows. I walked to each face of the structure and checked. North wall, solid block. East wall, solid block. South wall, solid block. West wall, the door, and nothing else. There was no window. There was no opening of any kind except the door and the conduit penetrations through the roof. I went back inside. I said, "Dana, I'm back inside the shed. Can you still see me?" She said, "Yes. You're standing at the workbench. You're looking at the radio." I said, "Which wall is the window in?" She said, "The wall opposite the door. The east wall." I looked at the east wall. Concrete block. Mouse droppings on the floor against the base. A water stain running from a crack in the mortar near the ceiling. I walked to the wall and put my hand flat on the block. Cold, solid, rough under my palm standard CMU texture. Dana said, "I can see your hand. It's on the window." I pulled my hand back. I stood in the relay shed on Henley Ridge and tried to process the fact that a woman I could hear on a radio that had been dead for 8 years was looking at me through a wall that had no opening. The mineral smell was stronger now. The warmth I had noticed when I entered was more pronounced. The air inside the shed felt 10 degrees warmer than outside, and it had no reason to. I sat on the workbench. I keyed the mic. I said, "Dana, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer carefully. Tell me exactly what you see and what you can describe about where you are." What followed was an exchange that lasted 1 hour and 12 minutes. I know the duration because I was monitoring the battery. The SRM 27 and 88 amp hours should run a Motrack base unit for a long time. But I did not know the radio's draw, and I did not want to lose the connection. I checked my watch at the start, 7:48 p.m. I checked it at the end, 9 p.m. During that time, I learned the following things, and I'm going to recount the conversation as precisely as I can, because the details matter and the order matters, and some of what she told me did not mean anything until days later. She said she was in a small room, concrete block walls, concrete floor, concrete ceiling, one opening the window in the east wall, a steel door in the west wall that she could not open. She said the room was originally 8 paces long and 8 paces wide. She was 5'6". I asked her about the construction. She said the blocks were standard 8x16 CMU with clean mortar joints. She said the floor was smooth-poured concrete, no drain, no crack. She said the ceiling was unfinished. She could see the form marks from the pour. She said there was a metal shelf on the north wall with nothing on it, and a small metal plate on the south wall near the door, about chest height, mounted with 2 small screws. I asked her to read the plate. She paused, and I heard her move the sound of shoes on concrete a few steps. She said, "It says 47-A-12. I did not say anything for a moment. 47-A-12 is the Bland County tax map number for the Henley Ridge parcel, the parcel I was sitting on. The plate she was reading was a property identification tag, the kind the county assessor's office stamps and mounts on structures for tax purposes. The structure she was in was tagged to this land. I said, "Dana, is there any other marking, any other text, any other hardware in the room?" She said, "No, just the plate, the shelf, and the window. The window doesn't have glass. It's just an opening, but I can't reach through it. When I put my hand to the opening, it stops at the surface of the wall, like there's something there that I can't feel but my hand can't pass." I said, "What can you see through the window right now?" She said, "You, the room you're in, the equipment rack, the battery on the floor. your thermos, your notebook on the bench. The door behind you is open, and I can see the tower outside. It's dark out. She was seeing the interior of the relay shed from the perspective of the east wall, looking west, toward the door. She was describing my belongings in correct position. The thermos was to my left. The notebook was on the bench. The battery was on the floor next to the rack. She could see all of it, through a wall that, from my side, was a solid CMU. I asked her what she remembered before the room. She said she was hiking, a trail in steep hardwood with a creek at the bottom. She said the leaves were turning orange and red, sourwood and maple, the kind of fall color that comes to the eastern mountains in mid-October. She said she came to a structure off the trail, a small concrete block building with no roof and no door, just walls and a floor, and an opening where a door should have been. She walked in to rest. She sat on the floor. When she stood up to leave, the doorway had a door in it, and the door would not open, and the sky above the roofless walls had a roof over it, and the opening in the east wall was a window looking onto a ridge she did not recognize. She said she did not know how long she had been there. She said she was not hungry in a way that matched the time she was hungry, but not starving, and she was thirsty, but not dying. I asked her what the date was when she entered. She said October 14th. I asked the year. She said 2016. I told her it was March 2025. The radio was quiet for what felt like a full minute, but was probably 15 seconds. Then she said I should be dead. She said it without inflection, like she was reading it off the metal plate. At 9 p.m., I told Dana the battery was getting low and I had to go. She said, "Please come back." I said I would. I disconnected the clips and the radio went dark and the shed was silent, and I stood there in the mineral warm air feeling like I had sealed someone into a room by turning off a light. I drove home. I did not sleep well. The house felt wrong in a way I could not articulate. Something about the proportions of the rooms, the height of the door frames, the way my footsteps sounded on the hardwood. I wrote it off as fatigue. In the morning, I searched for Dana Kelly, Lexington, Kentucky, 31 years old. I did not find a current record. What I found was a missing person report filed with the Kentucky State Police in October 2016. Dana Marie Kelly, age 31, last seen on October 14, 2016, departing a trailhead in the Daniel Boone National Forest for a solo day hike. Vehicle recovered at the trailhead at 8:15 p.m. Search conducted for 6 days. Tracking dogs lost the scent at a creek crossing approximately 2 miles from the trailhead. Subject never found. Report status open. 9 years. She had been in that room for what felt to her like days and what the calendar said was 9 years. She was not starving. She was not dead. She was behind a wall in a shed on a ridge in Virginia, reading a tax plate from the land she was looking at. And she had walked into an unfinished building in Kentucky in 2016, and the building had finished itself around her. That is when I went back to the county records, because I needed to know about the second structure. The one the building inspector's letter had mentioned the letter I had found in my initial research but had not fully processed. I drove to the Bland County Courthouse that afternoon and pulled the complete property file on 47-A-12. The 1979 permit was there. The inspector's letter was there, dated April 3, 1980, addressed to Harold Lotz. The subject line, Final Inspection, Henley Ridge Communication Installation. The body confirmed compliance with the approved permit, with one exception. The inspector noted that the secondary relay structure referenced in the original application had not been completed. Walls were up concrete masonry unit 8x8 footprint. Foundation poured. No roof, no door, no fixtures. The permit holder was advised to either complete the structure or remove the foundation within 12 months. A handwritten note in the margin, different ink, different hand, possibly Lotz's own, said, "Foundation poured. Walls up, not habitable. Will remove by October 1980. There it was. A second structure on the Henley Ridge parcel, built in 1979 or early 1980. Concrete block, 8 by 8. Walls up, no roof, no door. Exactly what Dana described walking into an unfinished building in the woods. The same type of construction, the same dimensions, and the county record said it was supposed to have been removed 45 years ago. But there was another document in the file that I had not seen online. A single-page memo from the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy, dated June 1979, addressed to the Bland County Planning Office. The subject was Geological Survey Consultation Henley Ridge Installation, Parcel 47-A-12. The body was brief. It stated that the department had reviewed Allegheny Southern Timber's proposed installation at the request of the county, and that the proposed location was consistent with subsurface geological conditions identified in the 1962 Mineral Survey of the Henley Ridge Formation. It noted that the installation's communication function was appropriate to the site's characteristics and recommended approval. It was signed by a state geologist whose name I did not recognize. I read that memo 3 times. A state geological agency had reviewed a timber company's application to build a communication tower and determined that the tower's location was consistent with subsurface geological conditions. Communication towers do not require geological review. You review geology for mines, for wells, for foundations and unstable soil. You do not review geology for radio tower on a ridge top. And the phrase appropriate to the site's characteristics. What characteristics? A communication tower's appropriateness depends on line of sight to other towers, elevation for signal range, access for maintenance, not geology, not what is under the ground. Unless the tower was not only a communication installation, unless the communication function the geologist referenced was not radio communication, unless the site's geological characteristics were the reason the tower was there in the first place, and the timber company's permit application was a legal wrapper around something older and less categorizable. I sat in the courthouse records room with 2 documents in front of me, a building inspector's letter about an unfinished structure that was supposed to be removed in 1980, and a state geologist's memo about subsurface conditions that made the site appropriate for something called communication. And I thought about Dana Kelly in an 8 by 8 concrete room with no roof that had grown a roof, no door that had grown a door, and a window that looked through a wall in a different state. I went back to the ridge that afternoon with my GPS and walked every foot of the saddle and the slope within a quarter mile of the tower. I was looking for the secondary structure's foundation, any remnant, any rubble, any clearing or grading scar that would indicate where an 8 by 8 concrete pad had been poured 45 years ago. I found nothing. No foundation. No broken block. No slab edge under the leaf litter. 45 years of forest growth will cover a lot, but poured concrete and mountain soil does not vanish. Frost cracks it, breaks it, pushes fragments to the surface. Tree roots displace it. It leaves evidence for decades. I have found abandoned foundations from the 1920s with less than an hour of searching. There was nothing here. But 60 feet downhill from the relay shed, on the east slope below the saddle, I felt the ground change under my boots. Warm. Not subtly warm, warm enough to feel through a Vibram sole and a wool sock. I crouched and put my bare hand flat on the leaf litter. The soil beneath was body temperature or higher. I scraped the leaves aside and pressed my palm to bare dirt. Warm. In an area roughly 8 feet by 8 feet. The air temperature was 43 degrees. The soil surface temperature on this slope on this day in March should have been 45 to 50. This spot was in the mid-90s. I could feel the heat radiating upward against my face when I leaned close. I marked the coordinates on my GPS. At home, I overlaid them on the 1979 permit survey plat. The warm spot was within 10 feet of where the secondary structure's foundation was drawn on the original site plan. The foundation was gone, the warmth was there, and the warmth was the shape of the building Dana Kelly was trapped in. I went back 5 more times over the next 2 weeks. I brought 2 fully charged batteries each trip. I brought my voice recorder, my notebook, my laser measure, and my tape. Each visit, I connected the battery and talked to Dana, and each visit I measured the relay shed. What I found was this. The east wall was getting thicker. Not dramatically, but consistently. On my first visit, the interior measured 10 feet even from east wall to west wall. 1 week later, 9 feet 11 3/4. The following week, 9 feet 11 1/2. A quarter inch per week. In construction, a quarter inch is within tolerance for a block wall. But block walls do not grow. Cured mortar in CMU does not gain mass. The wall was thickening on the interior face, and when I measured the exterior, the east wall was lengthening, adding material into the slope of the ridge, as if the building were extending eastward. 2 inches in 3 weeks. Continuous with the existing foundation, same mortar, same block, as if it had always been that size. My notebook said otherwise. Dana confirmed the changes from her side. The window was bigger, she said. The room was smaller, 6 paces now, not 8. The floor was warmer. The view was clearer. She could read the labels on my batteries. Interstate SR M-27. She could see the grain of the plywood on the workbench. And the door had changed. It had give now, a slight flex when she pushed, and she could feel cold air through the gap at the jamb. Mountain air, she said. Dead leaves and cold dirt and distance. On my 4th visit, she said she could hear me before I connected the battery. My boots on the gravel outside, my truck door closing. The connection was strengthening independently of the radio. The radio was not the bridge. The wall was. On my 5th visit, a Tuesday, 2 weeks and 4 days after my first, I measured the exterior of the shed and found that the east wall had gained a full 3 inches beyond my initial measurement. The building was growing eastward, into the slope, toward the warm spot where the secondary structure's foundation had been. And when I drove back down the 2-track that evening, I discovered that the changes were no longer confined to the ridge. The first collapsed culvert crossing the one that had been washed out since at least 2019 was intact. 12-inch corrugated steel pipe seated properly in the ditch, flowing clear water. No collapse. No erosion damage. The road surface at the crossing was gravel number 57 stone, standard road base, spread evenly, compacted by traffic that had not occurred. Ahead of me, toward the gate, the road was dirt and ruts as I remembered it. Behind me, between the tower and this point, the road was maintained. Fresh gravel, functioning drainage, a graded crown, as if the ridge were exporting its condition downhill. I got out of the truck and knelt on the gravel. Fresh, angular. The kind of aggregate that comes from a crusher, not river stone. I picked up a handful and let it fall through my fingers. It clicked against itself with the sound of a new material, not weathered road surface. The air smelled like crushed limestone, the same smell as the first half-mile of maintained road near the gate. But this section should not have had gravel at all. I drove the rest of the way to the gate. The road reverted to dirt about 100 yards past the culvert. The gate was as I had left it. Route 606 was normal. Bastion was normal. I went home. But I did not sleep because I had started watching my own house the way I watch a job site, measuring, comparing, looking for movement that should not be there. The crack in my basement wall answered that question the next morning. I have a crack in the east wall of my basement. My house is a 1978 ranch on a concrete block foundation in Wytheville, and I have been monitoring it for 6 years. Twice a year I mark the ends of the crack with a pencil line and a date. A standard practice for homeowners concerned about foundation movement. The crack had been growing at about a 32nd of an inch per year, which is within normal range for a house of that age on that soil type. It was not a structural emergency. It was a thing I watched. That morning, the crack was shorter. The most recent pencil mark from the previous October was inside the visible crack, meaning the crack had retreated past my mark. Concrete does not heal. Foundation cracks do not close. Mortar joints do not reknit. I got my tape and measured the crack width at 3 points where I had previous measurements recorded. Every measurement was smaller. Not dramatically 32nds of an inch, but smaller. My basement wall was repairing itself. I stood in my basement in my socks at 6:30 in the morning and felt the thing I had been feeling on Henley Ridge arrive at my home. The displacement, the word I had started using in my notebook because I did not have a better one, was 40 miles from the tower, and it was fixing my foundation. The next 4 days, I drove through Bastion twice, once going to the ridge and once coming back. I drove slowly. I looked at everything with the eyes I use on a structural inspection, not casual observation, but measurement, comparison, assessment. The gas station awning, which has been crooked for at least a decade, was straight. Not recently repaired, it had no new hardware, no new flashing, no evidence of work. It was simply straight, as if it had always been straight, as if the wind damage that bent the support bracket had not occurred. The church parking lot, which I have watched deteriorate for years, alligator cracking, potholes, the base course showing through was smooth. Dark, fresh-looking asphalt with clean-edge lines. The post office's sagging porch beam was level. A stone retaining wall along 606 that I knew had been leaning 18 months ago was plumb. I stopped the truck in front of the gas station and got out and put my 4-foot level against the awning support. Dead flat. I put it against the fuel island bollard. Plumb. I walked to the retaining wall and put the level against the face. Plumb. Every structure I checked in Bastion was in better condition than it had been the previous week, and none of it showed evidence of human repair work. No tool marks, no new material, no contractor signs or dumpsters or the debris that accompanies real renovation. The buildings were not being repaired. They were being corrected. Silently, without process, without labor, as if someone were editing the physical world the way you edit a document, going back and fixing the errors. The displacement was 6 miles from the tower now, and moving through the built environment of Bland County with no signs of stopping. And I understood, standing in front of the Bastion gas station with a spirit level in my hand, that this was not a rescue. This was not a connection between 2 rooms. This was a process, a spatial process, centered on the tower, radiating outward, rewriting the structural condition of everything within its expanding radius. Dana's room was getting smaller because the relay shed was getting bigger, and the relay shed was getting bigger because the process was pulling material or geometry or something I cannot name from a widening circle of structures and concentrating it on the ridge. The tower was the antenna. The wall was the aperture. And the entire built landscape of this county was the raw material. I went to the ridge on what I knew would be my last visit. I connected the battery. Dana was there. She said the room was 4 paces. The window filled most of the east wall. She could read my notebook from across the shed. The door moved 3 inches when she pushed it. She could feel the air, cold mountain air, the smell of March, the sound of wind in bare trees. She was close. Another few weeks and whatever boundary remained would fail, and she would be standing in the relay shed on Henley Ridge. I told her what I'd seen in Bastion. I told her about the road, the culvert, the gas station awning, the church parking lot, my foundation. I told her the displacement was spreading and I did not know where it would stop or what it would do to the structures it was changing. She listened. Then she said, "How many people live in that town?" I said Bastion had about 400 residents. The county had around 5,000. She said, "And what happens to their buildings if this keeps going?" I said I did not know for certain. I said buildings that are modified without engineering oversight can fail. Foundations that shift, even if the shift looks like improvement, create unbalanced loads. A crack that closes puts compression where there should be none. A road that improves on one side of a transition and not the other creates a differential that destroys the boundary joint. What was happening was not renovation. It was geometric drift, and it was affecting every structure in an expanding radius without regard for the engineering of any individual building. Load paths were being rewritten. The structures might look better, but they were being reorganized according to a logic that was not structural engineering. And the first time that logic conflicted with the building's actual load requirements, something would fail. Dana was quiet for a long time. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, "Close it." I said, "If I take the wall down, I don't know what happens to you." She said, "I know." I said, "I could come back. I could bring someone, engineers, geologists, someone who might." She stopped me. "You told me yourself. There is no expert for this. You said that, and you were right." Her voice was flat. That same patience I had heard from the beginning, the patience that was worse than fear. I asked her to wait. I said I would think. I would come up with something. She said, "My hands are changing. When I hold them up to the light from the window, I can see the ridge through them. Not like they're transparent. Like the ridge is printed on my skin. The trees. The tower. I can see the tower on the back of my left hand. I'm becoming the view." She paused. "I don't think I'm coming through the window. I think the window is coming through me." I sat on the workbench with my head down for a long time. The voice recorder was running on the bench beside me. When I played the recording back later, those minutes were not silent. There was a low sound, barely audible, like a foundation settling under new load, a deep, structural groan that I did not hear in real time, but the microphone picked up. The shed was under stress. The east wall was growing. The room behind it was shrinking. They were converging, and the sound of that convergence was the sound of a building being loaded beyond its design. I went outside. I looked at the east wall. Where there had been uniform CMU, there was now a faint rectangular outline in the block surface barely visible, like a ghost of a form line or a control joint that had not been cut. It was the shape and proportions of a door. I went to the truck. I took out the sledgehammer. I walked back to the east wall. I set my feet. The first blow hit the center of the outline and the block cracked, and something behind it cracked too, and the sound was doubled. Two walls breaking simultaneously, and a gust of air came through the gap that smelled like October leaf mold, cold creek water, sour wood and maple in full color, the air of an autumn day from 9 years ago on a ridge I had never been to. I kept swinging. Each blow opened the hole wider. Behind the broken block was not a room. There was nothing. Not an empty space and absence, a place where dimension stopped. My headlamp beam went into the opening and did not reflect, did not illuminate a far wall or a floor or a ceiling. Just dark that began at the plane of the broken block and continued without boundary. The air flowing out of it was getting warmer. The mineral smell was overwhelming, not like a well casing anymore, like heated rock, like the inside of a kiln. I swung until the opening was about 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. Then I stopped, because the Motorola in the shed behind me said my name. Not Dana's voice. My voice, my own voice, from the speaker of a radio I had not keyed, said clearly and without emotion, "Stop. She's gone. The wall is closed." I dropped the sledgehammer. I walked back into the shed and looked at the radio. The battery was still connected. The power light was on. The transmit indicator was dark. No one was transmitting. The channel display showed a frequency I had never seen on a Motorola unit. 00.000. All zeros. Dead channel. No carrier, no signal, no hiss. Just my voice, already fading. The last syllable of closed hanging in the speaker cone like the ringing after a bell. The dark behind the wall was gone. The opening I had made showed packed red clay and the root mass of a tulip poplar growing on the slope beyond. Dirt, just dirt, the kind of earth you see behind any block wall cut into a hillside. There was no room. There was no window. There was no warm air. There was no mineral smell. There was no Dana. I disconnected the battery. I packed the sledgehammer, the recorder, the clipboard, the batteries. I closed the shed door. I drove down the ridge. The road was dirt again. Rutted, eroded, both culvert crossings collapsed, and running muddy water across bare subgrade. The gravel was gone. Every inch of improvement between the tower and the gate had reverted. I drove through Bastion slowly, checking everything. The gas station awning was crooked. The church parking lot was crumbled. The post office porch beam sagged. The retaining wall on 606 leaned at its familiar angle. Everything the tower had fixed was broken again. Everything it had changed had reverted instantly, completely, as if the corrections had been provisional, maintained by the connection, dissolved when the connection was severed. When I got home, I went straight to the basement with a flashlight and my tape measure. The crack in the east wall was there. Open, pencil-marked, exactly as it had been for 6 years. The measurement at the widest point matched my October mark. I sat on the basement floor with my back against the wall and my hands on my knees, and I stayed there for a long time. The concrete was cold against my spine. The cold felt correct. The cold felt like the world I recognized. I sent Garland an invoice for the site visits. I wrote Horn Investigation and Assessment on the description line. I told him the horn had stopped on its own, and I recommended he leave the tower standing because demolition would cost more than it was worth and the structure was not a safety hazard. He paid the invoice within a week. He has not mentioned the hole in the east wall of the relay shed, which means either he has not been up there or he looked at it and saw what I saw on my last visit, dirt behind broken block, nothing more. I did not call the police. I did not contact the Kentucky State Police to update Dana Kelly's missing person file. I did not file any report with anyone. I had voice recordings of a woman speaking through a wall that does not have an opening, giving coordinates that correspond to empty forest in another state, describing a room that no longer exists, if it ever existed in any way that the word exists is designed to cover. The recordings are on a digital voice recorder in my truck's glove box. I have listened to them 11 times. Her voice is there, clear, specific, real. My own voice at the end is also there, saying words I did not say in a tone I did not use. The frequency readout, all zeros, is visible in the one photograph I took of the radio panel before I disconnected it. That was 3 months ago. I went back to framing houses and pouring footings in Wythe County. I drive past Bastion without stopping. I do not take jobs in Bland County. The crack in my basement wall is doing what cracks do, which is slowly, predictably getting worse. And the predictability of it is something I hold on to the way you hold on to a handrail, not because you are falling, but because the floor felt uncertain for a moment and you want to know the rail is there. Normal is what I traded Dana Kelly's life for. If she was alive, if the room was real, if any of it was anything other than a man alone on a ridge talking to a radio that happened to be warm. But last Tuesday I was doing a foundation inspection on a house in rural retreat, that is in Wythe County, about 30 miles from Henley Ridge and 50 miles from my home. The house was 1982 construction, standard CMU block foundation. The homeowner wanted a moisture assessment before finishing the basement. Routine job. I was in the crawl space with my flashlight, checking the east wall for efflorescence and cracking, when I found a small metal plate mounted with 2 screws at the base of the block near the footer. It was half covered in clay and cobwebs. I wiped it off with my thumb. Aluminum. 2 inches by 3 inches, stamped with black characters. 47-A-12. I measured the crawl space. The east wall was a 1/4 inch thicker than the west wall. In standard CMU construction, opposing walls should be identical in thickness. They are built from the same block, with the same mortar at the same time. A 1/4 inch of variation is within tolerance. Any inspector would pass it without comment. I know that. I also know that a 1/4 inch is exactly the weekly rate of change I measured in the Henley Ridge relay shed when the wall was growing. And I know that I have never, in 19 years of inspecting foundations, found a Bland County tax plate in a Wythe County crawlspace on a house that has no connection to parcel 47-A-12, owned by people who have never heard of Henley Ridge. I finished the inspection. I filed my report. I wrote, "Foundation in acceptable condition, no significant defects noted." I did not mention the plate. I do not know what I would say about it if I did. I drove home and sat in the truck in my driveway with the engine running, looking at my house. I tried to see it the way I see every structure: load paths, stress points, material fatigue. I tried to see my own foundation as just a foundation. I could not. The ground under my truck felt warm through the floorboard. I told myself it was the exhaust. I checked the crack in my basement wall that evening. It was a 32nd of an inch narrower than my last measurement, taken 3 days earlier. A 32nd of an inch is within tolerance. I keep saying that. I have started measuring the crack every morning. The pencil marks are getting closer together. The wall is doing something that walls cannot do, and it is doing it at the same rate, a 1/4 inch per week, that the relay shed wall was doing it when Dana Kelly could still see me through the concrete, and I could still hear her voice asking me to close what I had opened, and what now, apparently, is opening again somewhere else, in a house I inspected, in a crawl space 30 miles from the ridge, with a tag on it that belongs to the land where I swung a sledgehammer at the only window a woman who has been missing for 9 years had left to look through. I do not know if she is behind that wall in rural retreat. I do not know if the process is starting over or if it never stopped. I know that my basement wall is closing and that I can measure the rate and that the rate matches, and that matching is the thing I cannot make myself stop checking, because if the numbers match, then the system is the same. And if the system is the same, then it is still looking for an aperture. And this time the aperture might be in the foundation of my own home, and I do not have the right to break another wall. I do not have the right. But the crack is closing, and I do not know what is on the other side.